Well, good afternoon. I'm sorry to not be there in person. It's kind of a crazy week. Otherwise, I would be, and I apologize for being remote with you. But hopefully this can be useful to you. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I think that there is a way to wave at me over this thing and get me to stop talking. So if you want to talk to Matthew and get him to stop me en route and answer some questions, I'm happy to do so. What we're looking at right now, of course, is the school district boundaries for the state of New York. That gives us a sense of what kind of a crazy quilt we've got. Also shows you the density, population density by each of these districts. You know that very well. You know what things look like in Western New York, what things look like downstate. It really is an interestingly diverse school system that we have in the state, and it makes for some challenges. So let me proceed. Now, Kirsten Pryor is not with me today, so it's just going to be me. So let's continue through. So first point here is, if I can get this thing to start working for me. There we go. Okay. Just a little bit about us. Some of you know a bit about the Center for Governmental Research. We were started in 1915 by, I would say that Eastman Kodak's late George Eastman. Unfortunately, it's almost the late Eastman Kodak's late George Eastman. Eastman Kodak, as most of you know, is in Chapter 11. We're certainly hoping they come out of reorganization and continue functioning. But that's a big thing here in Rochester. But it's a great legacy that Eastman and Eastman Kodak has left in Rochester, and we're a piece of that. We work throughout the state of New York, pretty much every corner of the state. In addition, we have some active projects in Massachusetts, New Jersey, actually Ohio now, a little bit of work in Pennsylvania and Arizona. So just to give you a sense of our experience, municipal reorganization has been bread and butter for us for pretty much our entire history. We celebrated our 95th a couple of years ago, and I went back through the files looking at the things we had done over the years. And I was surprised to see how much commonality there was. And this issue, dealing with not just with general municipal governments, but also with schools, goes back pretty much through our entire history. More recently, in terms of public education, we conducted on behalf of the Rausch Foundation a cost comparison between Long Island schools and Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia schools are county-wide. Long Island, of course, Nassau County, famous for having 56 school districts within one county, a fair bit of fragmentation. We also looked at central business office opportunities in a number of different BOCES regions around New York State, and then a variety of service sharing studies at various different levels, both for BOCES, for individual school districts, between school districts and general purpose governments and other contexts. More recently, over the last couple of years, we've been working very closely with the Rochester City School District, helping them with their strategic plan, trying to figure out what that meant for them, and trying to help them in very granular ways to move the agenda of the school district forward. Jean-Claude Brizard was our school superintendent up until about a year ago when he departed for Chicago, so he's now running Chicago Public Schools. And Bohan Vargas was now recently confirmed as the permanent superintendent here. Interesting issues here in Rochester, very similar to the issues certainly in Buffalo and the other big urban school districts. We also just completed a regional high school study for Ontario County for Western Finger Lakes BOCES, the Wayne Finger Lakes BOCES, I'm sorry, which was an interesting study. There, the notion of going to a regional high school is something that has been discussed a lot in the state, and there's been some recent interest in it. And then also relevant, it seems like it was a long time ago, in 1993, we were asked by the State Education Department to answer the question, because the incentives for reorganization, for merger, are really so powerful in the state, why don't more districts merge? Many of the questions that were asked back then and the answers have, frankly, haven't changed a whole lot. I was part of that study. I joined CJR in 1991. Interesting conclusions. I'll come back to that a little bit later. School district reorganization, of course, isn't new for the state. There were over 10,000 school districts in the early 1900s, so we saw some pretty torrid consolidation through the middle of the last century. By the time we've gotten to 2011, we had just under 700 school districts, and there have been no significant reorganizations recently. And there are powerful incentives for consolidation. As I said, back in 1993, the State Education Department was surprised that with a 40% operating aid bump for consolidation over a 14-year phase-out, that more school districts didn't decide to reorganize. Moreover, building aid increases by 30%, up to 95% of approved costs. So the amount of money that state ed puts on the table for reorganization is really quite generous. BOCES aid, of course, supports cooperative services. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And then there are the Department of State local government efficiency grants, LGE grants, that have funded a number of reorganization studies across the state, including that regional high school study we just completed for Ontario County. So let's go on and take a look at what's going on. The regional high school studies in Wayne and Ontario, supported by a bill that's pending approval. I need to find out what the status is. I guess if it hasn't passed yet, it's probably not going to. Maybe if we get to Q&A, someone can give me the status on that. There needs to be a little bit more legislative direction on high school reorganization. To create a regional high school, the legislature really needs to provide some guidance. There's a presumption of certain kinds of aid, but until the legislation actually passes, we won't know. The other pieces pending, Nassau County has been working for a number of years looking at non-instructional services. We were involved with that project some years ago when Tom Swazi started it, but that continues. Again, with 56 school districts in the county, there's a lot of interest in focusing on more cooperation and trying to share services in ways to save money. And of course, the CBO implementations are significant. Now, why are we involved? Why do you care? It's because of money, obviously. We've got declining state aid. The property tax cap doesn't make things easier. Many parts of the state, most parts of the state, enrollment is going down, which is, far better than I, creates a real serious problem for an institution like a school district that has a fairly significant bricks and mortar component. So you can shrink the number of teachers, perhaps, but you still have this physical plant to maintain. What's more, with a collective bargaining agreement, sometimes shrinking the number of teachers isn't as easy as you might think. Not only do we have the declining cash, declining state aid, but we also have increasing expectations. We've into race to the top. The Obama administration's most recent effort has put pressure on schools, and before that we were working with No Child Left Behind, still exists obviously. Those increasing demands on accountability, reinforced at the state level certainly by the Cuomo administration, have put pressure on each of you and on your superintendents. So as a consequence, we've got to figure out how to solve some of these problems, figure out ways to do more with less. The spectrum of sharing, of course, is pretty broad. Anytime we get involved in a merger discussion, we also explore all the other options. And of course, there's a huge range of options, not just for school districts, but for general purpose governments. I just got back last week, several days up in the North Country, talking to some villages and towns about some of their merger options. In their case, they're talking about all the way from a complete dissolution of a village to much more modest changes, simply sharing their public works functions. Same spectrum exists for individual school districts. You can work through a centralized business office, or you could share specific positions, or you could go all the way to merger. And certainly BOCES helps. BOCES has its challenges. It's limited aidable services, and I would argue that the BOCES aid is perhaps leads to some mixed incentives. Question that folks will ask us all the time, and this again applies to general purpose governments as well as to schools, is how much money does this save? And I have to say that sadly we can't stand up and say, oh gee, this is going to cut your property tax bill by 25%. Particularly true with towns and villages, as they're a relatively small share of the property tax to start with. But it doesn't matter that most of the studies that we have done, most of the studies that we've reviewed, suggest that you perhaps look at 5% of operating savings out of the box or less. In your case, of course, most of the cost is in the classroom. In the classrooms, there's also been a shift in terms of cost, particularly around in the special education area, where you have had to increase your staffing concentration over time, and that has had an increasing impact on cost. The other thing that we've learned, and this goes back to our 1993 study, is that the consolidation doesn't necessarily help student outcomes. Now, particularly for those of you in very rural districts, you know that people will look at you and say, well, gee, you're such a small school district, surely you're not delivering the kinds of services that your students need. And we have found that that's very much a false statement. It's a false impression. That, in fact, some of the best outcomes in our Ontario County schools study, some of the best outcomes are at the smallest, most rural districts, and the districts that appear to have the smallest share of resources are actually delivering fabulous outcomes. So the outcome of impact on student outcomes from consolidation, again, I think that they're generally unclear, that there's no guarantee that making school districts larger improves the quality of education. Our 1993 study suggested that tax rates did fall, but that spending didn't fall. It's one of those consequences of aid. If a school district receives a 40% bump in its operating aid, it frankly has enough cash to be able to cut property taxes and increase spending at the same time. So it's not exactly the outcome that the state education department was looking for. Although I think it's unclear. Again, I think they're looking for increased opportunity for students, but also certainly part of the subtext there is a reduction in cost. But if the aid to make the merger is generous enough, then it makes it difficult, I think, for the schools to actually reduce cost. So some comments about school consolidation. First, it's very, very difficult to make generalizations. We think that the regional character kind of schools makes a huge difference. Consider Nassau County again. You've got 53 unified or elementary school districts and then 3 high school districts. 31 of these districts have 5 square miles or less. The size of the districts varies a lot from 674 up to, in Island Park, up to over 8,000 in Massapequa. Combined wealth ratio varies tremendously from 0.54 in relatively poor Hempstead up to nearly 5 in Oyster Bay. We see this county as being quite a disparate county. So what do you do around consolidation in that district? Again, with the small size, I mean, there's some really interesting possibilities. But compare that to Greene County, which feels a lot more like central or western New York. Greene has 7 districts, the smallest of which is 65 square miles. The largest is 174 square miles. So, simply, physically consolidating these districts, even though the number of students would suggest that it would be a good idea, because you've got some, in Wyndham, Ashland, Jewett, for example, you have only 411 students in the whole contemplating district. So you would think that merging with another district would make a lot of sense, but again, you've got this vast size problem to deal with. So it's a very, very different place. However, in this district, unlike the island, combined wealth ratio varies by a much smaller factor, only a factor of 2.6. So these are demographically, socioeconomically, much more similar districts. So, want to merge school districts in these two different areas, you have completely different issues to confront. Some, dramatic differences in socioeconomic status on the island, and then while the socioeconomic status isn't so great in Greene County, you have these vast distances to cover. So should it happen? Well, again, you can tell, I think that in some cases mergers make a lot of sense. In some cases they don't. We believe that the idiosyncratic factors, those factors that influence any particular pairing, really swamp the commonalities across districts. So unfortunately, or fortunately, I think it's just a bit of realism to acknowledge that when the districts are as different as they are in the state of New York, that you can't, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to the question, should school districts merge? There's no ideal size for a district. The number of students in a district varies, again, depends very much on the socioeconomic characteristics of the community, as well as the relative diversity, or the relative population concentration. And the research more or less confirms that. Syracuse University Maxwell School has done a fair bit of work studying this. But frankly, I believe that their conclusions are equivocal. If you tear apart the statistics that they're using, they're looking at a relatively small number of units. And those of you who've got a good background in stats, which probably is a lot of you, you know that if you've got 12 observations, which is the study they did between, for the districts between 87 and 95, the consolidations between 87 and 95, 12 observations. It's pretty tough to come up with statistically valid conclusions from 12 observations. Second study between, looking at between 90 and 2000, the 15 consolidations. Once again, 15 is a pretty small number. They tortured the statistics a little bit. I mean, they did the best job they could. I like the guys at Maxwell. I think they do responsible work. But nonetheless, we're still looking at 15 consolidations in that decade and then 12 in the other study. So the relatively few observations means the power of your statistical work is limited. And, lay that over the fact that these are hardly 12 comparable consolidations in the first study, 15 comparable consolidations in the second study. Each of these, again, is very, very unique and quite distinct from the others. Shared services, on the other hand, we think is very promising. Pretty much every community we go into, whether it's a school consolidation, this regional high school study we just completed in Ontario County, or we're looking at a village-town merger, we always find ways in which the communities can work together more effectively. And that lays the groundwork for even greater collaboration over the long haul. And if you focus on a shared services approach, you save a lot of the Sturm und Drang that goes from actually trying to put two school districts together. And back in 1993, when the State Education Department asked us why districts don't merge, and the basic answer we gave them was that we always heard two things really. One is that we've always been the Jaguars, and how could we possibly merge with the Bears? The Bears-Jaguars game being a highlight of the school season, and then secondly, this odd conclusion among school districts that the children in the other district are somehow different from ours. The subtext is they're perhaps, maybe a little more unruly than ours, maybe not quite as teachable as ours. But even when we as outsiders would conclude that those districts were as similar as two peas in a pod, nonetheless there is a level of suspicion, I think, between districts that makes it very difficult for these mergers to go forward. And this is also particularly true in the island, incidentally. Nassau County, because the districts, because there are relatively few towns and villages, there are only 3 towns in all of Nassau County, the school district boundaries do tend to capture socioeconomic status in a way that's more complete, I think, than we see here in central and western New York. So those differences between districts are significant. Now the CBOs we think are promising, again, allows the specialization of back office functions. We also think transportation could be, there could be a lot more cooperation around transportation. The work we did in, with Broome-Tioga BOCES suggested that those school districts could save some money by coordinating transportation. Problem is, of course, you've got to coordinate bell times and work much more closely together when you're coordinating transportation. CBO consolidation, we think, has been profitable in most places. It's we've seen evidence that suggests that this does allow the different district offices to focus on what they do best, allows them to segregate duties, improve internal controls. So that has been positive. On the flip side, and this is true for any kind of shared services or merger initiative, the savings tend to get eaten up because you end up having to level up pay and benefits. There's nothing that says that's the way it has to happen, but you understand the realities in an environment where there's a collective bargaining agreement. It's very, very difficult to bargain benefits and salaries down. So anytime we bring even departments together, you end up often spending more on a per unit basis than you did before. Finally, of course, transfer costs are significant. You have some legacy costs that you have to address. So while we think that the CBO model makes a lot of sense, once again, the conclusion on cost savings is perhaps a disappointing one. The cost savings we think will be substantial over time, but out of the box, often the cost savings are relatively modest. Technology issues abound. You're pulling together different systems, which make things difficult. Cultural issues are significant as well. Different departments have different operating procedures, and they do have very much a different culture. This is true pretty much wherever you bring organizations together. Job satisfaction, on the other hand, can be very good. If the consolidation is handled well, then the individuals who occupy these offices find new opportunities opening to them. So for the people who are ambitious and want to take on new responsibilities, they can be very pleased by CBO consolidation. So fundamentally, what are we suggesting? First, we have to remember the objective. The goal is to improve educational outcomes. We believe that the structure is much less important than productivity in the classroom. So while we can spend an awful lot of effort trying to bring the institutions together to merge two districts, that often there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that can improve what goes on in the classroom, teacher education, recruitment. All of these things I list on the slide can have significant impacts on student outcomes and also probably improve productivity and reduce cost. And these are issues that are under the control of an individual district and don't require the very complicated machinations that are involved in actually doing a merger. This perfect is the enemy of the good is a problem that we encounter all across the state, all the projects we work on. People have some sort of an ideal of how we would design school boundaries without having any boundaries already written. We think about how we could redraw the town lines and the village lines, and unfortunately, we don't really have that option in front of us. We don't have a blank slate. We have established communities. We have established boundaries. We have established workforces, and we have to work within them and to achieve some improvement for our students, which is the goal. And we think often we can do that without having to actually eliminate districts. So our mantra here is to blur the boundaries. You don't always need to erase them. Not that that isn't always, possibly, occasionally a good thing to do. We certainly have the potential to make much better use of distance learning and technology. There are a lot of policy changes that we could see at the state level to make that easier. Certainly, issues around collective bargaining agreements are important as well. And finally, let me get to BOCES. We think that BOCES is an institution that could be much, much better used across the state. The BOCES aid was, BOCES aid is well-intentioned. I mean, all about BOCES is well-intentioned. But it's, instead of making it possible for poor districts to use BOCES, instead what it does is encourages districts to use BOCES pretty much at any cost. So not at any cost, but BOCES aid drives a wedge between what districts pay and what it costs for BOCES to deliver the service. And that, unfortunately, can lead to some inefficiency. Moreover, there is this limit on what is truly BOCES aidable. And, you probably know well the politics here. There is a concern that BOCES not displace services that the private sector can provide, but unfortunately, the rules about what can be BOCES aidable and what can't are pretty vague and pretty much under the discretion of the state education commissioner. As a consequence, we end up with this odd list of things that are BOCES aidable as opposed to what particularly non-instructional services, as opposed to what's not BOCES aidable, and then we've got this price wedge. So what we have recommended is the notion that we convert BOCES aid to a block grant, make it possible for, for example, if you as a district have a particularly good program in one particular area, it should be possible for you to offer that as a service to other districts without necessarily going through BOCES. So that is also promising. We also think that the BOCES borders often are a little bit too robust and that we should be doing service sharing across those borders. And certainly back office opportunities don't need to just simply be between districts, but they could also be between districts and municipalities. Once again, we're the state of New York. We want to save money for all of the taxpayers of the state of New York, and all of us are paying both school taxes and town taxes and village taxes. So there's no particular reason why the effort to save money should strictly be between districts. We think that the school districts often could provide a very significant service to the municipalities that are around them. Villages in particular could benefit from sharing services with their school districts. With that, let me turn this back to you folks for any questions.
All right, Ken, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions for him?
Yeah. Can you hear me, Ken?
Barely. So speak up, please.
Ken, can you hear me now?
I can.
Great. Okay. Have you ever calculated the costs of the Tri-Bar decision in regards to the Taylor law? That has to do with the mandated teacher increases that we have to pay each year.
I think we'd all be afraid of actually coming up with that answer. Right? No, we haven't. I mean, simple answer is no. But Triborough, if you think about it methodologically, it'd be really difficult to come up with a precise number because what Triborough does is it delays a renegotiation of benefits. So, to say that, so you could take a particular situation, for example, and model how let's take probably the best example, which is health benefits, and how much money we could save on health benefits if we were able to take what ought to be a negotiation in one contract and have to stretch it over 5, which is seems seemingly how these things have to happen under Triborough. Triborough obviously very much empowers the status quo, and when you have a constantly evolving environment, particularly for benefits in the public sector and private sector, Triborough makes it just really, really hard to make those changes. So, again, I don't know how you'd actually calculate the total cost, but it's probably very substantial if you could.
Yeah, I agree. And the reason why I ask is you mentioned that we're trying to get more with less, and we're looking at the peripheral offices that do add a lot of value, like the CBO or the business office, but we keep avoiding the main issue of where the costs are, and I think you alluded to it, where the big costs are in the classroom. Yet we have contracts where we cannot apply the law of economics. We have a 2% tax cap levy, but we have a contract with personnel benefits that's increasing with either step salary schedules or health care benefits at 5 to 6 to 8% a year. So that's where our problems are.
You'll get no argument from this end of the phone. That's where all the it's that follow the money rule, right? It's not. Yes, there are dollars to be saved in each of your offices, I'm sure, as all of us could find ways to do more with less if we had to. But the big money is in the classroom. It's not sitting in your offices, And Triborough is just one of the things that makes dealing with that very difficult. Although, if I can say though, I think that sometimes we see school administrators and school boards not take advantage of all the tools at their disposal. We see this certainly in the city of Rochester, where the city of Rochester has, for example, really fallen down on the task of doing teacher evaluation. It's perfectly legal under the contract, and yet, teachers will talk about really not being evaluated at all, and then the tenure decision comes along, and and that goes past, and we've really lost the ability to address the problem of productivity in the classroom just because we haven't taken advantage of even the tools we have at our disposal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If I could go back to the shared CBO, if I could ask you going into the future as you look at that, please keep in mind the value, particularly of the districts up in this area of the state. We're very lean already, and there was a presentation earlier today about the value of the external audit, internal audit. And in many cases, we could overlay the business office for who's providing that value too. So it's like in these lean central district offices, we're providing much value already, and I'm concerned that could be lost with shared CBOs.
Well, my sense of the shared CBO is that it's the leanness that actually creates the opportunity. You know better than anyone that what you do is very technical, and there's just, complying with all of the rules of state education law and all of the regulations of the state education department is really a mess. And the advantage of a shared business office is that you can specialize more effectively. So it doesn't take as long to get up to speed on a new topic. All of you in relatively small districts, you're wearing about 15 hats. And to the extent that you can spread those hats out, there can be, again, I'm not arguing that the savings are enormous and that you're going to cut your property tax bills by 20%, but I think you may have an office that's better, that can be a better specialty office and provide better service to your districts. I don't see the CBO as a tremendous money saver, but I do think it can help you all deliver services